The evening of the Ashcroft Gala had been spoken of in every drawing room in London for the better part of 6 weeks. The invitations alone had been a small sensation: heavy cream card, embossed in midnight blue, sealed with the Ashcroft crest. The date, the address, the promise of something unprecedented. And underneath all the social anticipation, the single detail that had made it the most discussed event of the spring season: the gown. Everyone was coming to see the gown, because the gown was a legend before it had been worn once. The Ton had been talking about it since the Duke of Ashcroft had commissioned it from London's finest dressmaker, at the kind of cost that one did not discuss in polite company, but absolutely discussed in every other kind of company. 6 months in the making. Sapphires, real sapphires, not paste, not glass, sewn into a bodice of midnight silk that was itself so fine it moved like water. It had been seen by 3 women before its intended night of debut, and described, by each of them, in separate drawing rooms, with the kind of language usually reserved for cathedrals. No woman in London, it was whispered, had ever worn anything like it. No woman in London, once the Duke of Ashcroft was finished, ever would again. His Grace the Duke of Ashcroft had made this known, as he made most things known, publicly and without apology. The gown would be worn by his fiancée at the Spring Gala. The Spring Gala would signal to all of London, and more importantly to the gentlemen of finance, who had lately been asking pointed questions about the Ashcroft estate's liquidity, that the House of Ashcroft was not merely solvent, but splendid. That the Duke who wore the Ashcroft title wore it as magnificently as his grandfather had. That whatever rumours had been circulating about the estate's debts and the entailed properties and the quietly mortgaged hunting lodge in Berkshire were exactly what the Duke had always maintained them to be: the malicious speculation of small-minded people with nothing better to do. The gown would say all of this, you understand. The gown and the woman wearing it. That was the plan. The plan, on the night of the 6th of May, 1821, arrived at its critical moment approximately 43 minutes before the gala was scheduled to begin, when the Duke of Ashcroft's man of business opened the case that had been transported from the dressmakers to the Ashcroft townhouse and found, in place of 6 months of sapphires and midnight silk, a garment of such spectacular inappropriateness that he stood looking at it for a full 30 seconds before his brain was able to do anything useful with the information. What was in the case was a dress. That much was clear. That it was not, in any universe or under any interpretation, the dress that was supposed to be in the case, was equally clear and took rather less time to establish. It was a dress of washed-out grey muslin. It had been mended at the hem twice, with thread of a slightly different colour each time. The collar was fraying. There was a patch at the left sleeve that had been applied with evident care, but remained, unmistakably, a patch. It was the dress of a woman who had very little and had taken considerable trouble to make that little presentable. It was clean. It smelled faintly of lavender water, as though someone had treated it with the small kindnesses available when you have no others to offer. It had been folded with perfect neatness and placed in the case exactly where the sapphire gown should have been, with the particular deliberateness of a person who wants you to understand that the placement is intentional. The man of business said something I cannot repeat to you in polite company, and ran upstairs. And at that same moment, in the great ballroom of the Ashcroft townhouse, where the guests had been gathering for 20 minutes, and the champagne had been flowing, and the quartet had been playing, and the whole brilliant machinery of the season's most anticipated evening had been proceeding exactly as planned. At that same moment, a woman walked through the door. She was not wearing sapphires, The room went the particular quiet that a very loud room goes when it encounters something it has not been given the vocabulary to process. Not silent. There were still sounds, the clink of crystal, the last bar of music from the quartet, who had not received the appropriate signal, but the human noise of the room, the conversation and the laughter, drew itself in like a breath held before a plunge. She walked to the centre of the room and stood there, in the grey muslin and the mended hem and the fraying collar and the patched sleeve, with her back perfectly straight and her hands still and her face wearing the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for precisely this moment and intends to make the most of it. And then the Duke of Ashcroft came through the side door, and I'm going to stop us right there, right in the held breath of that room, right at the moment when his eyes found her, and the blood left his face, and the whole carefully constructed evening began, brick a brick, to come down. Because before I take you any further, I need you to do something for me. Find the subscribe button. Press it. It is entirely free, and it means that the next story, and there is always a next story, and it is always worth having, will find its way to you the moment I am ready to tell it. And if you will not subscribe, then you owe me one. That is the arrangement. I am patient about collecting, and I never forget. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of this particular reckoning, 6 months earlier, to a woman who had not yet decided exactly what she was going to do about the Duke of Ashcroft, but who was beginning to understand, with increasing clarity, that she was going to have to do something. The Hartwell family had never been grand. That was, in the particular lexicon of the English aristocracy, a significant distinction. Not disgraced, not fallen, not ruined, simply never grand. They had a name of good standing and a modest property in Wiltshire that had been in the family since the reign of Charles II, and that had, in the last generation, become something of a financial riddle, not unsolvable, but persistent. The kind of puzzle that required careful management and a degree of good fortune to see its way through. Miss Vivienne Hartwell was at the age of 24, the person who was doing the managing. I want to tell you about Vivienne Hartwell because the story of the sapphire gown is her story, and you cannot fully understand what she did, the coldness of it, the precision of it, the courage of it, without understanding who she was before the sapphire gown became relevant to her at all. She was, to look at, a handsome young woman of the unremarkable kind that gets overlooked in rooms where more conspicuous beauty is present. Dark eyes, a straight mouth, a composure that read, to those who hadn't earned the right to look closer, as plain self-possession. To those who had earned it, it read as the particular composure of a person who has spent years learning to show the world exactly as much of themselves as the world has demonstrated it deserves, which was, in most company, not much. Her father had died when Vivienne was 19 and her brother Edmund was 15, and the modest riddle of the Hartwell property had landed in its entirety on Vivienne's capable shoulders. She had managed it well. Not spectacularly, not with the flourishes of a woman blessed with significant resources, but with the focused and unglamorous competence of someone who has understood, early and without resentment, that competence is the most reliable tool available when glamour is not on offer. The property was still standing. Edmund was educated. The debts were contained. It had cost Vivienne 5 years of her life, and every social opportunity that those 5 years might otherwise have provided, and she had paid the cost without complaint, which is not the same thing as being glad to pay it. Edmund, at 22, had come into a modest inheritance from his godfather, £7,000 held in trust, released on his 22nd birthday. It was not a fortune. It was, for a young man of his particular situation, the difference between a future with options and a future without them. It was, in the careful arithmetic of the Hartwell family, very nearly everything. Vivienne had been aware, even before the trust was released, that £7,000 had a way of making a person visible to people who had not previously troubled to look. This was the arithmetic she understood. What she had not fully calculated, what, in all honesty, she could not have anticipated, was the specific visibility that the money would create and the specific person it would bring into the Hartwell orbit, and the specific use that person intended to make of both the money and the woman who came with it. The Duke of Ashcroft had been introduced to Vivienne at a mutual acquaintance's dinner in November, and he had been, in the first instance, everything his reputation promised. Handsome in the expensive way, the kind of handsome that is partly bone structure and partly the confidence of a man who has never doubted his right to be in the room, with the easy authority of a duke who has held a dukedom for 16 years and has consequently forgotten that authority is something one earns rather than simply owns. He had been attentive. He had been charming. He had asked all the right questions and attended carefully to all the answers. And Vivienne, who was a careful observer of people and prided herself on that carefulness, had noticed these things and told herself that noticing them was not the same as being seduced by them. What he had been very good at was the appearance of seeing her. That was the particular skill she had not anticipated, because it was not a common skill, and because it operated at precisely the level of her most guarded want. He had asked her opinion about things that people did not usually ask her opinion about: the management of an estate, the cultivation of a difficult tenant relationship, the precise mechanism of a trust she had referenced in passing. He had listened to her answers with focused interest and responded in ways that demonstrated he had actually heard them, and Vivienne, who had spent 5 years being the person in the room who managed things and was therefore not expected to have views about them, had felt, in his company, the particular warmth of being regarded. She had known, even then, that this could be a performance. She was not naive. She had simply lacked the evidence to distinguish performance from sincerity, and she had been careful about it, had tested him, in small ways, over the 6 weeks before the proposal, asking questions that a man who was genuinely interested in her would answer differently from a man who was interested in what she came with. He had passed most of the tests. He had not passed all of them, and the ones he had not passed, she had added to the mental ledger with the careful neutrality of a woman who has learned that the truth arrives when it is ready and cannot be forced to arrive sooner. She had been not quite seduced for 6 weeks before he proposed, and she had accepted because she was 24 and practical, and the Hartwell property was still a riddle, and because Edmund's £7,000 sitting in trust would last longer and compound better with the social protection of a good marriage around them, and because the Duke of Ashcroft had not yet given her any concrete reason to distrust him, and concrete reasons are what careful women require. The engagement was announced in January. The gala was fixed for May. The sapphire gown was commissioned in November, which Vivienne had not known about until February, and which had struck her when she discovered it as extravagant beyond the Duke's apparent means. She had filed this observation in the careful mental ledger she kept for things she did not yet know what to do with. There were other observations in the ledger: the painting that came down from the drawing-room wall, the particular careful vagueness with which he answered direct questions about the estate's income, the fact that his man of business appeared at the townhouse with documents more frequently than the ordinary management of a prosperous estate required, the way the Duke changed the subject from anything specific to anything general when the conversation turned toward finances. Each observation was small, taken alone. Taken together, and added to the growing weight in the ledger that she was not yet ready to open fully, they formed a picture that she was not ready to name, because naming it would require her to do something about it, and she had not yet decided what to do. The ledger filled up in March. To understand what the sapphire gown meant to the Duke of Ashcroft, you need to understand what the Duke of Ashcroft was. Beneath the good bones and the easy authority and the 16 years of being the most important man in every room he entered, you need to understand what was left when you stripped away the title and the townhouse and the reputation, when you stood close enough to see the seams. What was left was a man of 38 with debts that made his hair go cold when he thought about them, and the particular comprehensive problem of a man who has been raised to present magnificence and cannot stop presenting it, even when the presentation is all that remains. The Ashcroft estate was mortgaged. The hunting lodge in Berkshire had been quietly sold the previous summer to a merchant who had the good manners not to make too much of it in society. There were 3 gentlemen creditors in London, men of considerable financial standing and limited patience, to whom the Duke owed sums that had ceased to be comfortable some time around the winter of 1819, and had since become pressing and then urgent, and most recently threatening. The gala was a performance, not merely a social occasion. The Duke had given evening parties before, there was nothing novel in that, but a specifically designed, financially motivated performance intended for an audience of 3, and those 3 were the creditors. What the Duke was offering them, on the evening of the 6th of May, was a vision. He was showing them, here is the estate's social standing, here is the manner of man I am, here is the woman who has chosen me, and who comes with the means to stabilize what requires stabilizing. Look at the gown, look at the jewels, look at the room. Does this look like a man who cannot meet his obligations? Does this look like a man who requires your patience? The gown, was the argument. The gown had cost £430 to commission. This was money the Duke did not have, and he had obtained it through the creative financial mechanism of selling a painting from the Ashcroft collection to a dealer in Covent Garden, who had not asked too many questions about the provenance. The painting was gone, quietly. The gown would announce its presence magnificently. That was the exchange he had made, a thing of genuine private worth for a thing of spectacular public visibility, a real asset for an appearance of assets. The arithmetic of a man who understood very well how much his world ran on appearances, and who had decided one final time to bet everything on the appearance rather than the substance. The creditors had names and histories, and the particular quality of men who have lent large sums to aristocrats, and have consequently developed a very fine-tuned sense for the difference between a man in temporary difficulty and a man in structural collapse. Mr. Pemberton was the most significant of them, a merchant banker of 53, whose family had financed half the estates in the county of Berkshire, and who had, 3 years earlier, extended the Duke of Ashcroft a sum that he had described to his own partners as speculative. The other 2, a Mr. Holsworth and a Mr. Crane, were less significant in individual terms, but collectively represented the full picture of the Duke's financial obligations, and the picture was not one that anyone was going to hang on their wall. The Duke had been managing them, as he managed most things, with charm and misdirection, and the authority of a man who has never had to justify himself to anyone. He had been doing this for 2 years, and the charm had held, and the misdirection had held, and the authority had held. Because authority, Vivienne had come to understand, is self-fulfilling up to a point. A duke is taken seriously because he is a duke, and because he is taken seriously, he can continue to ask for patience and receive it. And the patience can be extended and extended until the moment when the evidence becomes impossible to set aside in favor of the manner. The gala was the Duke's answer to the evidence. He was going to fill a room with the visual argument that he was a man of continued substance. He was going to do this with champagne and a quartet and the best addresses in London in the room, and the most extraordinary gown the season had produced. He was going to say, without words, because the most effective arguments in that world were always made without words. He was going to say, "Look, this is what we are. Does this look like collapse to you?" It was, Vivienne recognized, a genuinely clever move. Not honest, but clever. The gap between those two things was, she had come to understand, the whole essential nature of the man. And Vivienne would wear it. That was the arrangement. Vivienne would stand in the centre of his gala in the sapphire gown, and she would be the argument made flesh, the respectable young woman from a decent family with a manageable fortune who had chosen the Duke of Ashcroft. Which choice would signify to anyone watching that the Duke of Ashcroft was still a man worth choosing? She had not known, in January, that this was the full extent of her role. She had understood the social mechanics, understood that fiancés appeared at their intended events, that this was expected and ordinary. She had not understood that she was a financial instrument, that the figure she was intended to cut on the evening of the 6th of May was less the figure of a beloved woman and more the figure of a collateral asset, that the sapphire gown was not a gift or a romance or an extravagance of affection. It was a prop in a scheme she had not been invited to understand, worn by a woman whose primary value to the man she was engaged to was the £7,000 held in trust in the name of her 22-year-old brother. She had not understood this in January. She understood it entirely by March. The marriage settlement document was not, in the ordinary run of things, a document that a prospective bride was expected to read in detail. There were solicitors for such things, the bride's solicitors and the groom's solicitors, two sets of men who negotiated in technical language and presented their conclusions in summaries. Vivienne had a solicitor. The solicitor had reviewed the document. The solicitor had presented a summary. The summary did not contain the clause that Vivienne found on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when the Duke's man of business left the draft settlement on the library desk while he stepped out to take a message, and Vivienne, who had been sitting in the library reading and who had never once in her adult life passed up the opportunity to read a document she was not supposed to read, opened it and read it. The clause was in the 3rd subsection of the 4th page, which is where you put things you would prefer to slide past notice. It was written in the language of settlement documents, which is the legal equivalent of fog, thick enough that you cannot see through it unless you know what you are looking for. And Vivienne, who had managed a property through 5 years of difficult arithmetic, knew exactly what she was looking for. She read it once, and then again, and then she sat very still in the library for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took for the full weight of what she had read to arrange itself into a clear picture. The clause concerned Edmund's inheritance, not Vivienne's modest portion. That had been addressed elsewhere in the document, in the conventional terms. Edmund's inheritance, the £7,000 held in trust. The settlement, as drafted by the Duke of Ashcroft's solicitors, contained language that would, upon the marriage, grant the Duke's household trustees a degree of oversight over the Hartwell Trust that amounted, in practical terms, to control. Not immediate dissolution, not crude enough to be refused outright at a first reading, but the slow, legally defensible mechanism by which a patient man could, over the 3 to 5 years following the marriage, redirect the assets in question toward purposes the trustees deemed appropriate for the consolidated estate. The trustees, naturally, being appointed by the Duke. Edmund's £7,000 would, within 5 years of Vivienne's marriage to the Duke of Ashcroft, belong to the Duke of Ashcroft. And Edmund would have no legal recourse, because Vivienne would have signed the settlement, and the settlement would have been reviewed by a solicitor who had not read the 3rd subsection of the 4th page with sufficient attention. Vivienne sat in the library with this knowledge for 4 minutes, and then the Duke's man of business came back for his document, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked pleasantly at nothing, and he retrieved the papers without noticing anything, and she said, when he asked if she required anything, that she was perfectly well and would take tea presently. She did not take tea. She sat in the library a while longer and thought about the sapphire gown, which was by that point already 6 months in the making, and about the gala, which was 9 weeks away, and about the 3 creditors she had heard mentioned in a conversation she was not supposed to have overheard, and about the painting that had come down from the drawing-room wall in February and had not, as far as she could tell, been replaced. She thought about all of these things, and then she thought about Edmund, who was 22 and trusted her, and had never, in his life, understood that the world was capable of the kind of cold mechanical dishonesty she had just read in the 3rd subsection of the 4th page. She thought about what she was going to do, and the question answered itself with the particular clarity of an answer that has been waiting to be asked. She was not going to do what a woman in her position was expected to do. She was not going to quietly withdraw from the engagement, or write to her solicitor with politely worded concerns, or accept the outcome that a powerful man had calculated she would accept. She was going to do something that could not be undone, in a room full of witnesses, in a manner that left no ambiguity at all about what had happened and why. She had 9 weeks to prepare. She began the following morning. What Vivienne Hartwell did in the 9 weeks between the library and the gala was, on the surface, very simple. She continued to be the Duke's charming and untroubling fiancée. She attended the events he arranged and was pleasant to the people he introduced her to, and expressed no opinions that required managing. She smiled at the right moments. She deferred at the right moments. She was, in every visible particular, exactly what she had always appeared to be, a sensible young woman of good character, navigating her engagement with the conventional grace expected of her. Underneath that surface, she was building something else. She visited the dressmakers twice, on the pretext of fittings for the sapphire gown. The first visit was a fitting. The second visit was not. On the second visit, she established, with the kind of practical thoroughness that the dressmaker respected because dressmakers, as a profession, have an evolved ability to recognize women who know exactly what they are doing, that the gown would be stored at the dressmaker's until the week before the gala, at which point it would be transported by the Duke's household to the Ashcroft townhouse for safekeeping. Vivienne asked several sensible questions about the timing of the transport and thanked her warmly and left. She spent an afternoon in an area of London that was, by the standards of her social circle, rather far east of fashionable. She visited several establishments of the kind that deal in second-hand clothing, honest establishments, the sort where you can find perfectly good garments at prices that reflect what people can actually afford, and where the proprietors ask no questions because their customers are exercising the ordinary right of buying and selling things, which requires no explanation. She was looking for something specific. She found it in the 3rd shop. A dress. Grey muslin. It had been washed until the colour had gone mild and the fabric soft. It had been mended with the meticulous care of someone who loved it and could not afford another. She paid a fair price for it and took it with her, and when she arrived home, she put it through her own laundry and pressed it, and added a careful application of lavender water, and folded it with perfect neatness and put it away. She wrote to Edmund. Not about the clause, she did not want to frighten him before the matter was concluded, but about the management of certain financial documents, which she asked him to ensure were held in his own name with his own solicitor, not under any joint arrangement. Edmund, who trusted her absolutely, did this without asking why. She made one further visit, on a Wednesday, to the offices of a charitable institution whose work she had long admired, the Whitmore Foundation, which ran a relief fund for women in reduced circumstances and held periodic sales of donated goods to support their operations. She did not mention on this visit anything specific. She asked several questions about the organization's procedures for receiving and distributing donations of various kinds. She left with the information she required, and a donation of a more conventional sort, because the institution did good work and deserved the support. And then she waited. And the waiting was not easy, because waiting never is when what you are waiting for is the end of something. And this was the end of several things at once. The end of an engagement, the end of a scheme that had been built around her without her knowledge, the end of a life she had been edging toward and had realized, in a library in March, she did not want in the form it was on offer. I want to be honest with you about those 9 weeks, because Vivienne was a real person, or the kind of real person that a story needs in order to be worth the telling, and real people do not move from discovery to action without the complicated middle part. She had doubts. Of course she had doubts. She had doubts not about the Duke's character, which she had settled entirely to her own satisfaction on the afternoon in the library, but about the wisdom of what she was planning to do. She could simply withdraw from the engagement, quietly, citing irreconcilable differences in temperament. She could write to her solicitor, have the clause removed, demand a revised settlement, and if the Duke refused, she could end it there without any public involvement at all. These were available options. She considered them seriously, because she was a serious woman who considered her options seriously. What she kept coming back to, when she considered those options, was the creditors. If she withdrew quietly, the gala would still happen. The Duke would find another approach, another woman, perhaps, or another scheme, or a simpler consolidation of his debts. The creditors would still be in that room, and they would still be told, by implication, that the Duke was a man of restored substance, and some of them might believe it, and the extension of patience might continue, and the Duke would continue to be the man in the room with the authority of a man who has never been required to account for himself in public. He might do this to someone else. He was the kind of man who would do this to someone else. Vivienne had read the 3rd subsection of the 4th page, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who has managed things for 5 years and understands what cold-blooded calculation looks like when it is dressed in charming attire, that she was not the first woman this calculation had been run on, and she would not be the last. She could not stop him from being what he was. She could not, in one evening, reform the mechanisms that produced men like the Duke of Ashcroft, and the specific harm those mechanisms did to the women who came within their orbit. But she could, in one evening, in front of a room full of witnesses, including the 3 men whose continued patience was the foundation of his continued functioning, make it impossible to pretend that the harm was not happening. She could make the thing visible. She could make it undeniable. She could do it in a way that was so clear and so complete that the story of it would move through London for weeks. And the next woman he smiled at in a November drawing room would have, somewhere in the social ether, the story of what had happened to Vivienne Hartwell. and might attend to her own ledger a little more carefully. That was the whole of her reasoning. Not revenge, exactly. Or not only that, though she was honest enough to acknowledge that there was satisfaction in it that was not entirely altruistic. But the thing underneath the satisfaction was the simpler and more solid thing. That silence, in cases like this, was its own kind of participation in the outcome. And Vivienne Hartwell had managed enough things alone in her adult life to know that you should not be silent about things you have the standing and the facts to name. The gown arrived at the Ashcroft townhouse on the morning of the 4th of May, 2 days before the gala. It was transported in a large flat case with the dressmaker's mark on it, handled with the kind of care that valuable things receive when everyone knows they are valuable. Vivienne watched the case carried upstairs from the landing, and she was pleasant and expressed appropriate admiration, and she went to her room and dressed for a morning call. The morning call took 2 hours. In the course of those 2 hours, the gown left the Ashcroft townhouse by an arrangement Vivienne had made with her own maid, and by the end of the afternoon it had reached the offices of the Whitmore Foundation, which had agreed, on the understanding that they would not be asked questions that were not their business, to hold a significant donation for a specific purpose until called for. The grey muslin dress was folded into the flat case. The case was returned to exactly where it had been. I want to say something about what this cost Vivienne, because I would be doing her a disservice if I described it only in the terms of a plan efficiently executed. The sapphire gown was, she knew, extraordinary. She had seen it. She had stood in the dressmaker's fitting room in it, just once, and had seen herself in the glass as a version of herself that she had never been before, and would not be again, lit from within by the extraordinary blue of it, by the weight and the sheen of the silk, and the cold fire of the sapphires. She was not a woman who spent a great deal of time on vanity, but she was not made of stone, and she had stood in that dress and felt, very briefly, the intoxicating pull of what it would mean to be seen like this. To walk into a room and be undeniable. She had stood in that dress for 4 minutes. Then she had thanked the dressmaker and got dressed in her own clothes and left. The intoxicating pull was real. The alternative was her brother's £7,000 disappearing into the Duke's estate over the next 5 years, while she smiled at his creditors. The calculation was not difficult. She had never needed glamour to be undeniable. She had something better than glamour. She had been sitting on it for 9 weeks, and in 2 days she was going to use it. And what she was going to do in that ballroom was going to be more memorable than any dress. She slept soundly on the night of the 5th. She dressed simply in the morning. She ate a good breakfast and read the news. She was composed in the particular way of a woman who has prepared for something completely and knows that preparation is the only thing within her control and has therefore let everything else go. She was ready. I told you she walked into the ballroom. Let me tell you now what that actually looked like from the inside of it. The guests had been gathered for 20 minutes, and the room had achieved that particular pitch of a well-oiled Regency evening. Not quite at its full social height yet, still warming, the conversation moving from polite to comfortable, the champagne doing its usual work. The room knew about the gown. The room had been talking about the gown, in the restrained but avid way of people who believe they are being discreet about something they are not being discreet about at all. There was a quality of anticipation to the gathering, a readiness, a collective tilting toward the door that Vivienne felt as she came through it, before she had taken 3 steps, before anyone had properly registered what they were seeing. What they were seeing was this. A woman of 24, dark-eyed, straight-backed, with the kind of face that does not signal its intentions ahead of time. She was wearing a grey muslin dress that had been mended at the hem and had a patch on the left sleeve, and a collar beginning to fray at one edge. It was clean. It was pressed. It smelled faintly of lavender water. It was, in the context of this room of silk and satin and gemstones, of women in the finest money could assemble, and men in evening dress that represented the cumulative judgment of 200 years of aristocratic tailoring. In this room, it was a statement so deliberate and so precisely aimed that the room required a moment to understand it, and when the room understood it, it went quiet. The understanding moved through the gathering in stages, the way understanding always moves through a crowd, not all at once but in a wave, starting at the people nearest to her and spreading outward through the room as each cluster of guests registered what was in front of them and communicated it to the people beside them, who communicated it further, until the whole of the assembled company had arrived at the same information. The quartet reached the end of a bar and paused for breath, and in that pause the room was effectively silent for the first time all evening. She had worn something they had come to see replaced. The sapphire gown, the legend, the sensation, the promise that had been the engine of this whole gathering, was not present. Where it should have been, in the architecture of the evening, as everyone had understood that architecture to be, there was instead a dress that a woman of very modest means might wear to the church where her family had always worshipped, on a Sunday when she had taken particular care. Its presence in this room was not an accident. The room, which was comprised of people experienced in reading social situations, could see immediately that it was not an accident. The grey muslin had been chosen. The woman wearing it had chosen it with the full knowledge of what it would mean to wear it in this room, and she was wearing it with a composure that was itself a declaration, the composure of a woman who has made a decision she is prepared to defend. I have told these stories for long enough to know what that particular composure looks like, and to know what it costs, and I want you to understand what Vivienne was holding in that room. She had walked through the door of the most prestigious gathering she had ever attended, among people who had known the sapphire gown was coming, in the opposite of the sapphire gown, and she was doing it without flinching, because flinching was not available to her as an option. Not because she did not feel anything, because she felt everything, and had made the decision to feel it steadily, and to stand on the feeling rather than be carried away by it. That is what composure of that kind costs. Not its absence, but its presence, feeling the weight and choosing to carry it upright. Not silent, not the silence of shock exactly, but the silence of calculation, the rapid social arithmetic of 200 people simultaneously working out what they were looking at and what it meant and what the appropriate response to it was. Vivienne walked to the center of the room, which was an act of will so controlled that it looked like an act of ease, and she stood there, and she did not look at the floor or the middle distance or the exit. She looked at the room. She looked at every face that was looking at her. The faces were doing a range of things. Some were looking away, which was the instinctive response of people who have been brought up to understand that acknowledging a scene is participating in a scene, and who preferred, for various reasons, not to participate. Some were looking with open curiosity and the beginning of a smile that knew something interesting was happening. Some, the three men standing near the fireplace, who were not holding champagne with the ease of people who are guests in the ordinary sense. Some were looking with the focused, rapidly evaluating attention of people for whom this room was not a social occasion, but a business meeting, and who had just received a piece of information that needed to be incorporated into their calculations. Lady Forsyth, who was 64 and had attended social occasions in this city since before the turn of the century, said to her companion in a voice that was meant to be private and was not quite, "That is not the gown." No one laughed. That was the most significant thing, in that first suspended moment. No one laughed because laughter would have required a verdict on what they were seeing, and the room had not yet arrived at its verdict, and the room was waiting. Vivienne understood this as clearly as she understood anything. The room was waiting for the Duke of Ashcroft. The side door opened and he came. The Duke of Ashcroft had been told, 37 minutes previously, that the gown was gone. He had been told by his man of business, who had opened the case and found the grey muslin and come immediately to find him. And the Duke had gone from disbelief to fury, to a rapid and increasingly desperate attempt to understand how this had happened and whether it could be fixed in the time remaining. It could not be fixed. The gown was somewhere in London, or outside it, or in the possession of someone who could not be identified, and therefore could not be addressed. The case it had arrived in held a dress of grey muslin that was, in the cold assessment of everyone who saw it, the precise opposite of what the evening required. The Duke had spent 35 of those 37 minutes trying to solve the problem of the gown. He had spent 2 minutes thinking about Vivienne. He came through the side door, and he saw her, and I want you to understand what his face did in that moment, because it matters to the story and to what comes after it. His face did not do the thing of a man who sees his fiancée and registers her presence with any warmth. His face did the thing of a man who sees the central component of a failing plan and assesses the damage. The look he gave her was the look of a man cataloguing a problem. The warmth was not present because the warmth had not, in the particular way that makes this whole story what it is, ever been present to begin with. And the room saw his face in the same way that the room had seen everything else that evening, and the room noted it, and the room drew the conclusions that the room was drawing. He crossed to her. The room did not stop watching. "Where is it?" he said. His voice was low and controlled. He had been raised to be controlled, and 38 years of practice meant that even now, even here, the control was almost intact. Almost. "Vivienne, where is it?" She looked at him with an expression that could not, later, be described as anything but perfectly pleasant. "Where is what, Your Grace?" "The gown." The control thinned very slightly at its edges. "The gown that was specifically, the gown." Vivienne considered this. She said, at a volume precisely calibrated to be heard by anyone who was listening closely, and therefore by everyone in the room. "The sapphire gown? I'm afraid I gave it away." The silence that followed this was the genuinely silent kind. "You gave it away," said the Duke, "to the Whitmore Charitable Foundation. They have a fund for the relief of women in reduced circumstances, and they hold occasional sales of donated goods to support it. I thought the gown would raise a very significant amount for them. The sapphires alone." "You had no right," he said, and the control broke cleanly through the surface of his voice, "to give away property that belonged to this household." "I had every right to give away property that belonged to me," said Vivienne. "The gown was commissioned to be worn by me, on my person, for my appearance at this event. Whether it constitutes household property or personal property is, I confess, an interesting legal question, and one that I suspect may be less easily resolved in your favour than you are currently assuming." She paused, and in the pause the room took a collective breath. "But that is not the interesting question, is it? The interesting question is why you care so much more about the gown than about anything else in this room." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given an argument he has not prepared for and who is working very quickly. "You have made a scene," he said, "in front of my guests and my—" "Your creditors," said Vivienne. "Yes." "Mr. Pemberton, good evening. I mentioned that we had not been formally introduced. I am Miss Hartwell. I understand you have an interest in the financial arrangements of the Ashcroft estate. I thought you might like to know about a clause in my marriage settlement, the one concerning my brother's inheritance. Pemberton, who was 53 and had not survived 30 years in the lending of significant sums by failing to hear things he was supposed to hear, gave her his full attention. "Vivienne," said the Duke. His voice was different now. The authority was still present, but it was load-bearing in a way it had not been before. You could hear it working, which you should never be able to hear. "Vivienne, this is neither the time nor the—" "It is a very interesting clause," said Vivienne, "the sort of clause that one only includes in a settlement when the purpose of the marriage is primarily financial rather than personal. The sort of clause that tells you rather more about a man's intentions than he would prefer you to know. The sort of clause—" And here her voice went very level and very clear, and the room, which had been very nearly silent, was now completely silent. "That a young woman reads in a library and recognizes immediately as the mechanism by which a man of declining fortunes intends to use her brother's inheritance to meet his obligations to his creditors, while presenting himself, on the evening of a well-attended gala, as a man of considerable means who simply requires a small extension of patience and good faith from the gentleman to whom he owes very large sums of money." The room said nothing. It had been saying nothing for some time, but this was a fuller kind of nothing. Even the residual sounds, the settling of glasses, the shift of a foot on the floor, had ceased, as though the air itself had decided to pay attention. "The figures," Vivienne continued, with the composure of a woman who is prepared for an examination and is finding it easier than anticipated, "are in the settlement document. I can provide the clause's exact wording if that would be helpful for any of the gentlemen present who are currently reviewing their position. The mechanism is elegant, I will grant that. It is written so that it reads, to a casual eye, as a standard provision for trust oversight. It is only when you understand the specific effect it would have on the particular trust in question, my brother's £7,000, held and released on his 22nd birthday, that you see what it actually does. What it actually does is give this household's trustees the legal mechanism to redirect those funds, over a period of 3 to 5 years, toward the estate's existing obligations. My brother would lose his inheritance. The estate's creditors would, depending on the order of payment, recover a portion of what they are owed, and I would be married to a duke who had very cleverly solved his financial problem without ever having to acknowledge that he had one. She looked at the duke when she said this last part. He was the colour of old wax. "This is," he said, after a moment that was not long enough for him to find a better response, "a misrepresentation of a standard legal provision that you have clearly misunderstood. And I must ask you, I was responsible for the management of a property for 5 years," said Vivienne. "I understand settlement documents. I understand trusts. I understand the specific difference between a provision for oversight and a provision for control. And this provision is for control." A pause. "You may, of course, deny it. That is your right. But I would point out that the document exists, that my solicitor can produce it, and that the gentlemen present this evening are in a position to assess the credibility of my account and yours with the information available to them." She looked at the 3 men by the fireplace with the clear, measured directness of a woman who has calculated exactly what she is doing. "I suspect they have made their assessment already." The room said nothing. It had been saying nothing for some time, but this was a fuller kind of nothing. The Duke of Ashcroft looked at Vivienne Hartwell in the grey muslin dress with the mended hem and the fraying collar, and he did what a man who has run out of all his other tools does as a last resort. He reached for his dignity. "This is not the place," he said. No, said Vivienne. You are right. The place would have been a drawing room in November, before I agreed to an engagement, or a solicitor's office in January, when I might have been shown the complete settlement rather than a summary, or perhaps your library in March, when your man of business was kind enough to leave the draft document on the desk while he stepped out. She paused. But here we are. And since the gentleman I was going to marry has, in my presence, shown himself more concerned with the whereabouts of a dress than with the well-being of the woman who was to wear it, I find I am no longer interested in locating a more appropriate venue. The dress, he said, and the desperation came through now, fully and without the benefit of the control, was worth £430. Do you have any understanding of— I have every understanding of what it was worth, said Vivienne. I have also every understanding of what you intended to do with what I am worth, and what my brother is worth, and the difference between a man who values a woman and a man who values her as a line item in an estate account. She looked at him the way you look at something you have examined completely and found wanting. I would like to end this engagement, Your Grace. I believe the terms that best serve all parties present are these. You release me from any formal obligation. You make no claim on the Hartwell estate or the Hartwell Trust, and in return, I will not ask the gentleman by the fireplace to see a full accounting of the Ashcroft finances, which I suspect would answer certain questions they have been asking. She inclined her head with perfect courtesy. You have been kind enough to arrange a room full of witnesses. I appreciate the thoroughness. There is a moment in the collapse of a man's reputation when the room decides. It does not announce the decision. It does not vote. It simply reaches a collective judgment in the way of 200 people simultaneously arriving at the same conclusion, and then the verdict is in, and nothing that follows can change it. The evening of the 6th of May reached its verdict approximately 90 seconds after Vivienne finished speaking, and the verdict was delivered, as verdicts so often are in polite company, almost entirely in silence. Mr. Pemberton excused himself from the room. His 2 colleagues followed. They did not make a scene. They were not the kind of men who made scenes. They simply took their hats at the door from the footman, and they left, and everyone in the room watched them leave, and what the watching communicated did not require translation. The exit of 3 specific people from a room is, ordinarily, a minor event. In this room, on this evening, it was the evening's verdict delivered in the most unambiguous possible form. These were the men the gala had been arranged for. These were the men the champagne was for, and the quartet, and the sapphire gown, which was now confirmed by the absence of the gown and the presence of the grey muslin and the conversation everyone had just heard, to have been a prop in an evening that was itself a prop. Everything in the room was performance, serving a specific audience, and the specific audience had left. What remained was everyone else. And everyone else had also, in the course of the last 20 minutes, been given rather more information than they had been invited to the evening expecting to receive. The Duke stood in the centre of the ballroom that he had arranged and paid for, and filled with creditors and guests and champagne and a quartet, and every signal of a man at the height of his powers, and he had the gown's absence and the creditor's absence and the room's verdict, and Vivienne Hartwell, still perfectly composed in her grey muslin, and he had nothing at all with which to answer any of it. He said, at one point, something about the settlement. He said, at another point, something about what was legally and formally agreed. He appealed to the room with the reflexive confidence of a man who has always found the room on his side and had not yet fully absorbed that the room had changed sides some minutes ago. He said Vivienne's name twice in a way that was intended to reclaim something and did not reclaim it. Lady Forsyth, still not quite whispering, said to her companion, "He is arguing about the dress. Even now, he is arguing about the dress." He was. There was a moment. Vivienne would remember this for a long time, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular clarity of a thing that is exactly what it appeared to be. There was a moment when he turned to the room and said, as though the room might be brought to his side by the information, that the dress had cost £430, that it had been a commission of the highest order, that to have it removed from the household without authorization was— and he paused here, because the word he was reaching for was apparently theft, and even he could see in the room's face that theft was not a word that was going to work for him tonight. He did not say it. He said instead that the matter was one for the courts to determine, and that he expected— He did not finish the sentence. I do not know whether he did not finish it because he could not find the end of it, or because he heard, in that moment, how it sounded to the people in the room, and chose to stop. What I know is that the sentence ended unfinished in a quiet room, and then the quiet room became a room in which people were beginning to move, with the organic, unreversible motion of people who have decided the evening is over. Not dramatically, not in a rush, in the steady, unargued, unreversible way of a room that has found the evening over. The quartet, which had been frozen in a state of professional uncertainty for some minutes, was quietly dismissed. The champagne was no longer being replenished. The room began, without any organizing principle beyond the organic movement of people who have decided they are elsewhere, to empty. Vivienne said, to no one in particular, because the Duke had turned away, "I believe I will wish everyone a pleasant evening." And she walked out of the ballroom of the Ashcroft townhouse in her grey muslin dress with the mended hem and the fraying collar and the lavender water, with her back straight and her hands still, and the room which had watched her walk in and had watched everything that followed, watched her walk out. And the watching was different now. Not the curious, suspended watching of a room that does not know what it is, seeing. The clear, settled, certain watching of a room that knows exactly what it has just witnessed, and will be describing it to drawing rooms across London within 48 hours. She did not look back. She did not need to. The drawing rooms of London took the story and worked with it for the better part of 3 weeks, which is the standard season for a truly excellent scandal. And this was a genuinely excellent scandal. Not because of the cruelty in it— there were crueler scandals— but because of the clarity. The story was simple and complete and entirely without ambiguity. A man had valued a dress over the woman wearing it. A woman had demonstrated this publicly, efficiently, and with the particular style that the ton, which appreciated style above most other things, found genuinely admirable. The dress itself became part of the story, because the charitable institution sold it within a fortnight of its donation, and the sale raised an amount that was reported, in the sympathetic section of the press, as extraordinary. The sapphires were real. The silk was genuine. The woman who bought it at the charitable sale was the wife of a successful merchant in Cheapside, who had, all her married life, thought that beauty like this was not for people like her, and who wore it. The following season, with the confident joy of a woman who understands that beautiful things are most themselves when they are worn by people who are glad to have them. There was, in the weeks following the gala, a particular conversation that happened in several drawing rooms simultaneously, conducted by women who had attended various events of the previous season and were now, in retrospect, reviewing certain dynamics with new information. The conversation had the quality of something being finally named that had long been present but unlabeled. The Duke had not, it emerged, been the first man in that social circle to structure a marriage settlement in a manner that bore closer examination. He was simply the first man to have it examined, in public, by someone who had read the relevant clauses and understood them and was prepared to say so. The conversation about settlement documents and what they contained and whose interests they served was, by May of 1822, a rather more common conversation than it had been in May of 1821, and this was not unrelated to the evening of the 6th. Vivienne did not take credit for this. She did not attend the drawing rooms where the conversation was happening. She was, by that point, doing something else. The Duke was left with his title, his debts, and the absence of the gown, which was not, if we are honest, the point of his grief. What the absence signified was the point. The gown being gone meant that everything he had tried to do with it, the performance, the argument, the elaborate signal of a prosperity he no longer possessed, was also gone. Not stored somewhere, not reclaimable, not available to be tried again in another room with another plan, given away, used for something that actually needed it, converted, by a woman he had not taken seriously, into something worth far more than £430. He had spent money he did not have on a thing he needed to imply he had the money for, and the whole circular structure of it had collapsed exactly as circular structures do when someone removes the single prop at the centre. The prop, in this case, had been Vivienne Hartwell's willingness to participate in the arrangement, and Vivienne had removed it. He had come to the evening trying to present magnificence. What he had presented instead was himself. And himself, without the accessories, had not been enough. What she was doing, and I mention this because it is the true end of the story, and the true end of the story is not the evening in the ballroom, but what the evening made possible. What she was doing, way more, was managing the Hartwell property, which had not stopped requiring management, and looking after Edmund, who had not stopped requiring a sister, and occasionally in the evenings, writing letters to a solicitor she had engaged to represent her interests in the formal dissolution of the engagement. The formal dissolution had gone very smoothly. The Duke had not contested it. He had, she suspected, calculated that contesting it would require him to produce the settlement document in a legal context, and that the settlement document in a legal context would have effects that were considerably worse for him than the alternative. He had signed the papers. He had not, to her knowledge, sent a note. He had sent, 3 weeks after the gala, an envoy, a young man from his man of business's office, with a proposal that was dressed up as a concern for her reputation, but was, in fact, a request that she agree not to speak further about the specific clause in the settlement document. The envoy had been polite. Vivienne had been equally polite. She had said that she made no undertakings regarding what she might say or not say in the future, but that she had no current intention of speaking further about the specific clause, because she had already said everything she needed to say about it, in front of everyone who needed to hear it at a time of her own choosing. She had offered him tea. He had declined, politely, and left. Edmund, when he was finally told the whole of the story, sat quietly with it for a moment, and then said that he was very glad his sister was the kind of person she was. This was true, and he meant it entirely, and it remains the most honest verdict on the whole affair that was ever delivered. Vivienne did not marry that season. She did not marry the following season either, and she was entirely at peace with this. She had, she told Lydia, A friend who had heard about the gala second-hand and arrived at Vivienne's door 3 days later with a bottle of good wine and the expression of a woman who wanted the whole story told to her properly, she had decided that the conditions of her next engagement, if there was to be one, would be made clear before rather than after the relevant documents were signed. She had further decided that the next man who expressed an interest in her would be shown a copy of the settlement clause before matters progressed to the point of a gala. This struck Lydia as an eccentric approach to courtship and would, she thought, filter out a significant proportion of the field. Vivienne said this was rather the point. Lydia poured them both another glass and toasted the point. What Vivienne had gained, in the ballroom of the Ashcroft townhouse in the grey muslin that smelled of lavender, was not immediately legible in the ledger of the ton. Not a husband, not a settlement, not the kind of social conclusion that resolved things. What she had gained was the thing she had always owned, but had not always been permitted to exercise fully: the knowledge of her own precise value and the willingness to make it plain to anyone who tried to set a different price. What Vivienne Hartwell did was not a grand gesture or a theatrical rebellion. It was something smaller and more permanent. She decided, in a library in March, that she would not accept the valuation a greedy man had placed on her. She decided that she was worth more than a line item in an estate account. She decided that her brother's future was not available to be quietly absorbed by someone who had looked at her family and seen, not people, but resources. And she acted on that decision with the thoroughness and the patience and the precision of a woman who had learned, by necessity, to manage everything she was given without waste. The world is full of drawing rooms and contracts and settlements and beautiful dresses that are used as arguments for things they should not be used to argue. The world is full of people who look at other people and see instruments rather than individuals. The mechanics of how this is done have changed across the centuries. The thing itself has not. And the thing Vivienne Hartwell did in that ballroom, naming it, in public, calmly, in the grey muslin, with the room watching, is, in its essentials, available to anyone who has the facts and the steadiness and the willingness to be undeniable without the dress. Edmund's £7,000 remained in Edmund's name, under Edmund's control, managed by a solicitor of Edmund's choosing, and Edmund, when he was finally told the whole of the story, sat quietly with it for a moment, and then said that he was very glad his sister was the kind of person she was. This was true, and he meant it entirely, and it remains the most honest verdict on the whole affair that was ever delivered. Vivienne did not marry that season. She did not marry the following season either, and she was entirely at peace with this. What she had gained, in the ballroom of the Ashcroft townhouse in the grey muslin that smelled of lavender, was not immediately legible in the ledger of the ton, not a husband, not a settlement, not the kind of social conclusion that resolved things. What she had gained was the thing she had always owned, but had not always been permitted to exercise fully: the knowledge of her own precise value, and the willingness to make it plain to anyone who tried to set a different price. The Duke was left with his title, his debts, and the absence of the gown, which was not, if we are honest, the point of his grief. What the absence signified was the point. The gown being gone meant that everything he had tried to do with it, the performance, the argument, the elaborate signal of a prosperity he no longer possessed, was also gone. Not stored somewhere, not reclaimable, not available to be tried again in another room with another plan, given away, used for something that actually needed it, converted by a woman he had not taken seriously into something worth far more than £430. He had come to the evening trying to present magnificence. What he had presented, instead, was himself. And himself, without the accessories, had not been enough. That is the whole of the story. It is not a comfortable one for the Duke, which is as it should be, and it is not a tidy romance for Vivienne, which is also as it should be, because not every story about a woman finding her own power ends with a proposal, and the ones that do not are not lesser for the absence of one. They are simply a different kind of complete. Now, you have sat with me all the way to the end of this one, and I am grateful, as I always am, for the company. If this story has given you something, the small particular satisfaction of watching a thing exposed for what it is, or the particular pleasure of a woman who knows her own worth and acts accordingly, then I would like to invite you to subscribe to Jane Tells Stories, where there are a great many more of these, in many registers, at all the temperatures that stories can reach. And if you will not subscribe, well, the arrangement stands. You owe me one. I will collect it eventually. I am, as you have seen from the company I keep, endlessly patient. Good night. And mind the third subsection of the fourth page.